The flames danced violently against the midnight sky, painting the darkness in hues of orange and red. The smell of burning wood and livestock filled the air, a sickening combination of loss and destruction. Daniel Carter stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs as the crackling inferno consumed the barn his grandfather had built with his own hands. His horses neighed in terror, their cries mixing with the wailing of sirens in the distance. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, struggling to dial 911. But deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning, a message, a final attempt by the HOA to break him, to make him surrender. And if they thought he would walk away from this, they were dead wrong. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. Daniel Carter had lived on that land for as long as he could remember. 20 acres of open fields, a farmhouse with peeling white paint, and a barn that had stood the test of time, weathering storms and generations alike. It wasn't just property, it was his legacy, the last piece of his family's history that hadn't been sold, paved over, or turned into another soulless suburban development. But now, it stood as an island in a sea of uniform houses, the only thing keeping him from being swallowed whole by the HOA that had formed around him. At first, they came with smiles, well-dressed board members knocking on his door with friendly offers, telling him how much easier life would be if he just joined. He wouldn't have to worry about maintaining his own road, they said. They'd help with property values, community events, even offer exclusive benefits. He didn't need benefits. He had his land, his animals, his peace. So he politely refused. But they didn't take no for an answer. The letters started soon after, harmless at first. Reminders of HOA meetings he wasn't obligated to attend, invitations to reconsider his decision. Then the tone shifted. Warnings, citations, complaints about the unsightly nature of his property, the faded paint on his barn, the tractor sitting in the yard, the rooster that crowed too early in the morning. Letters turned to fines. Fines he legally didn't have to pay but were sent anyway, piling up in his mailbox like a constant, nagging threat. Then came the inspections. HOA representatives walking along his fence line, jotting notes on the clipboards, whispering to each other while pointing at his land as if he was the invader, the one who didn't belong. He confronted them the first time, only to be met with rehearsed smiles and hollow assurances that they were only looking out for the neighborhood's best interest. It wasn't long before the neighborhood itself turned against him. The stare started when he drove into town. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. Conversation stopped when he entered the store. Flyers appeared on doors and in mailboxes, showing pictures of his farm alongside captions about community pride and preserving property values. They didn't say his name, but they didn't have to. He was the problem, the holdout, the stain on their perfect suburban dream. And yet, none of it compared to what happened next. It started small. His mailbox knocked over, his fence mysteriously broken in the night. Then one morning he stepped outside to find his well filled with cement. No note, no explanation, just a silent message carved in stone. It took everything in him not to lose control, to not storm into that HOA meeting and call them out for what they were. But he had no proof, no witnesses, just the gut-wrenching knowledge that they wouldn't stop until he either gave in or left. And still he stayed. He fought back in the only ways he could, reinforcing his fences, installing security cameras, documenting everything. But even as he tried to hold his ground, he couldn't shake the unease settling deep in his bones. Something was coming, something worse. He just didn't know when. That night, he found out. He had been restless, unable to sleep, pacing the porch with a cup of coffee when the barking started. His dogs, normally calm, even at night, were losing their minds, snarling and growling in the direction of the barn. Then the smell hit him. Thick, pungent, smoke. His stomach lurched as he turned, eyes widening in horror as he saw it. Flames, licking up the wooden beams, spreading fast, too fast for it to be an accident. The fire had started from within. He ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he bolted toward the barn, ignoring the blistering heat, the embers floating through the air like deadly fireflies. His horses screamed, trapped inside, kicking at the stalls, desperate to escape. He fumbled with the latch, coughing, eyes burning, pulling the doors open with everything he had. The animals burst free, trampling past him into the night, their terror more deafening than the crackling flames. His heart pounded as he turned back, sprinting toward the corner where his tools, his feed, his grandfather's old saddle were stored. But it was too late. The roof collapsed in a violent crash, sending a shower of sparks into the sky, sealing the barn's fate. He stumbled back, the heat pushing him away, forcing him to watch as everything he had built, everything he had fought to protect, was reduced to nothing but ash. The sirens arrived too late. The fire department did what they could. But by the time the flames were out, all that remained was a smoldering skeleton of charred wood and twisted metal. One of the firefighters approached, his face grim, as he pulled off his helmet. "Mr. Carter, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but this fire, it wasn't natural. We're looking at arson." The words barely registered. Daniel knew. He had known the second he saw the flames. And now, as he stood there, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes, the realization settled over him like a weight he could no longer ignore. They had gone too far. The HOA had tried to ruin him, to force him out, to break him. But all they had done was ignite something far more dangerous. They thought they could take everything from him. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming next. Daniel Carter stood in the wreckage of his barn, the morning sun casting long shadows over the smoldering remains. The fire had taken everything. The feed, the tools, the memories, burned down in a night of malice. He barely slept, the scent of smoke still thick in his lungs, his muscles aching from the exhaustion of fighting a battle he had no way of winning. But this wasn't just about a barn. This wasn't just another act of intimidation from a group of entitled suburban overlords. This was war. The moment the firefighters confirmed arson, Daniel knew exactly who was responsible, even if he didn't have the proof yet. The HOA had spent months trying to force him out, and when their petty fines, their threats, their social exile hadn't worked, they had resorted to the one thing they knew would break most people: destruction. They thought he'd give up, take the insurance payout, and leave. They thought they had broken him, but they had only made him angrier. The first thing he did was check his security footage, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through the recordings, his gut twisting in anticipation. He watched the grainy black and white screen, eyes scanning every frame. Then he saw it, a shadowy figure moving toward his barn in the dead of night. The person carried something heavy, something that glinted in the faint glow of the security light. A gas canister. Daniel's stomach dropped. He rewound the footage, freezing the frame when a car's headlights briefly illuminated the driveway. He knew that vehicle. He had seen it before, parked outside HOA meetings, always near the front. Mark Reynolds, the HOA's vice president, the same man who had once stood on Daniel's property, clipboard in hand, warning him that life would be easier if he just complied. Now Daniel had him, caught in the act, not clear enough for an immediate arrest, but enough to force a confrontation. He printed out the footage and drove straight to the sheriff's office, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The deputy on duty listened, flipping through the images, nodding in understanding but offering little reassurance. "This is good evidence, Mr. Carter, but it's not quite enough. A car parked outside doesn't prove intent, and the figure, well, it's too dark to positively ID." Daniel wanted to slam his fist on the desk, wanted to demand justice, but he knew how this game worked. The HOA had money, lawyers, connections. It would take more than blurry footage to bring them down. The deputy sighed, leaning forward. "Look, I know what's going on. I know they've been after you for a long time. But you need to be careful. Whoever did this, they're not afraid to escalate." Daniel scoffed. "Escalate? They already burned my damn barn down. The deputy didn't argue. He just handed Daniel back the photos. Keep your cameras rolling. Stay alert. And if something else happens, call us immediately. Something else did happen. The next morning, Daniel stepped outside to find his mailbox not just knocked over, but ripped from the ground entirely. The post snapped in half like a twig. His fence, once strong and sturdy, had been slashed apart. Wires cut in places where the livestock could escape. His water troughs had been overturned. His crops trampled in careless destruction. The message was clear: get out. But Daniel wasn't going anywhere. He spent the entire day repairing what he could, reinforcing his remaining fences, checking every camera angle, making sure he had every inch of his property covered. He didn't sleep that night. Sitting on his porch with a shotgun resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the driveway, waiting. The neighborhood had turned completely silent. Where once his presence was met with forced pleasantries or disapproving stares, now people just avoided him altogether. No more casual conversations at the feed store. No more small talk at the diner. The HOA had made him an outcast, and worse, they had convinced the rest of the community that he was the problem. Flyers had been passed around with manipulated images of his property, edited to look worse than it was. They claimed he was hoarding junk, that his animals were a health hazard, that his refusal to join the HOA was causing neighborhood distress. Lies stacked on lies, creating a narrative that painted him as the villain. But not everyone had turned. Karen, his only true ally left, stopped by that evening, her expression filled with unease as she clutched a piece of paper in her hand. "Daniel, you need to see this," she said, handing him the flyer she had taken from her neighbor's mailbox. It was worse than he expected. The newest HOA notice wasn't just complaining about him. It was calling for action. The words were carefully crafted, but the intent was clear. Our community's safety and property values are under threat. It is time to take measures to ensure compliance. Daniel read it twice, his pulse pounding in his ears. They're rallying the whole damn neighborhood against me. Karen hesitated, glancing around before speaking in a hushed voice. There's more. I overheard a conversation at the HOA meeting last night. Victoria Langford was talking about you, about how if you won't listen, they'll have to make sure you do. A slow, simmering rage burned inside Daniel as he folded the flyer, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. They thought they could push him out. They thought they could take everything from him and walk away untouched. They were wrong. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to strike again. He was going to take the fight to them. Daniel had spent the entire night waiting, gripping his shotgun, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The wind rustled through the trees. The occasional creak of old wood breaking the silence, but there was nothing. No figures creeping onto his land, no cars pulling up to his gate. Just silence. But he knew better than to let his guard down. The HOA had already proven they were willing to go further than he ever imagined. First, the petty fines, then the vandalism. And when that didn't work, they escalated to destruction. They had burned down his barn, destroyed his property, turned the entire neighborhood against him. He had taken it all, repaired what he could, installed more cameras, filed reports with the sheriff, and still, it wasn't enough to stop them. He could feel it in his gut. Something worse was coming. The HOA wasn't done with him yet. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon when he heard the sound of tires crunching against gravel. He tensed, his grip tightening on the shotgun, but when he saw who it was, he exhaled sharply. Karen. She pulled up in her old truck, her face tight with concern, stepping out with a newspaper folded under her arm. "Daniel, you need to see this." He met her at the fence as she shoved the paper into his hands. His stomach dropped the moment his eyes landed on the headline, "Local Farmer Under Investigation for Environmental Hazards." He scanned the article, his jaw clenching with every line. It was filled with complete lies. Claims that his land was improperly managed, that his animals were creating a health risk, that his refusal to comply with HOA regulations was endangering the community. Fake reports, fabricated statements from anonymous, concerned neighbors. And the worst part, the article suggested that county officials were already looking into it. "They're trying to bury you, Daniel," Karen said, voice low, eyes darting toward the houses that line the edge of his property. "If they can't get you to leave, they're going to make sure you don't have a choice." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, a slow, burning fury that mixed with exhaustion and frustration until it formed something dangerous. He had played by the rules. He had ignored them when they harassed him. He had rebuilt after they destroyed his barn. But this was an attack he couldn't ignore. If they got the county involved, if they managed to push this far enough, they wouldn't need to burn another building to the ground. They would come in with legal orders, with fines and regulations he couldn't fight alone. And if he lost his land, he lost everything. He turned without a word and stormed back to his house, Karen following behind him. He grabbed the folder of evidence he had compiled, photos of the vandalism, copies of the threatening letters, and most importantly, the security footage from the night of the fire. He shoved the grainy images toward Karen, pointing at the dark figure near the barn. "Mark Reynolds," he muttered. "That's his car parked outside. That's him with the gas canister." Karen swallowed hard, eyes scanning the image. "This is enough to at least get an investigation started, right?" Daniel shook his head. "Not enough. Not yet. But I know how to get what we need." That evening, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He attended an HOA meeting, not as a bystander, not as a target, but as a man with nothing left to lose. When he walked into the community hall, the murmurs started immediately. People turned in their chairs, whispers spreading like wildfire. He ignored them, his focus locked onto one person, Victoria Langford. She sat at the head of the long table, perfectly poised, her expression unreadable as he took a seat near the front. The meeting dragged on with the usual mind-numbing discussions about neighborhood maintenance and community projects, but Daniel waited until Victoria finally brought up his property, her voice smooth, calculated. "We have received concerns from multiple residents regarding the continued non-compliance of Mr. Carter's land, and as such, we have begun discussions with county officials about necessary enforcement." Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out the stack of printed photos. "You mean like this?" He tossed them onto the table. The room fell silent. Victoria's smile barely wavered, but her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Mark Reynolds, sitting 2 seats down, paled as he stared at the image of himself near Daniel's barn. "This is slander," Victoria said coolly, but Daniel wasn't done. He pulled out the article, holding it up for the room to see. "You've been feeding lies to the press, spreading rumors, turning my neighbors against me. And I know exactly why. You wanted me gone. You wanted my land. And when I didn't give it to you, you decided to take it another way." A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Some residents looked between each other, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. The tight control Victoria had maintained over this community for years was starting to crack. But she wasn't backing down yet. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "Daniel," she said smoothly, "I understand you're upset, but these accusations. I have security footage." He cut her off. The words sent a ripple through the room. Even the board members who had been backing her looked uneasy now. Victoria's expression faltered for the briefest second before she forced a smile back into place. "That footage doesn't prove anything." Daniel stared at her, voice low, dangerous. "It proves enough. And if you don't shut this down, if you don't call off your attack dogs, I will take everything I have to the sheriff and to my lawyer. And when I'm done, I'll make sure every single person in this room knows exactly what kind of corruption they've been living under." Silence stretched thick and heavy. Victoria's eyes met his, a silent battle waging in that moment. Then, slowly, she leaned back, tilting her head. "You don't have proof of anything substantial," she murmured, almost too quiet for anyone else to hear. "And without proof, you have nothing." Daniel let a small, Cold smile touched his lips. Then I guess it's a good thing I know exactly where to get it. He stood, turned on his heel, and walked out of that meeting, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally starting to realize just how deep the rot had spread. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Victoria would fold, if Mark would crack under the pressure, or if the HOA would double down on their attack. But one thing was certain. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel didn't waste any time after walking out of that meeting. The air outside was thick and humid, the sky a deep shade of blue, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, turning over everything he had just done, everything he still needed to do. The HOA thought they had buried him, that they had pushed him into a corner with no way out, but they had underestimated just how much fight he had left in him. He climbed into his truck, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. There was only one thing left to do. He needed undeniable proof, the kind that would force the sheriff's office to take action, the kind that would leave the HOA scrambling for cover. And he knew exactly where to get it. The next day, Daniel met with Susan Reynolds, a lawyer who had a reputation for tearing apart corrupt organizations. She was sharp, relentless, and most importantly, she hated HOAs with a passion. As soon as he laid out his evidence, his security footage, the vandalism photos, the flyers, and the newspaper hit piece, she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with something dangerously close to excitement. "They screwed up," she said simply, tapping her manicured nails against a folder of documents. "And they're about to pay for it." She wasted no time filing a lawsuit against the HOA, naming Victoria Langford, Mark Reynolds, and several other board members directly. Harassment, property damage, defamation. The charges stacked up like a house of cards, and Daniel knew that once one fell, the entire thing would come crashing down. But a lawsuit wasn't enough. He needed criminal charges. He needed arrests. And for that, he needed someone to crack. It didn't take long. Mark Reynolds had always been the weakest link. A man who talked big when he had backup, but folded like a cheap suit when the pressure was on. The sheriff's office had been hesitant to move forward at first, but once Susan got involved, once the threat of a civil lawsuit loomed over them, they had no choice but to start digging. And when they did, it was only a matter of time before they found what they needed. Financial records showing HOA funds being funneled into personal accounts. Emails discussing strategies to force Daniel off his land. And then the final piece, the one that broke everything wide open, a recorded phone call between Mark and another board member, in which he admitted that Victoria had personally ordered the fire. She said it had to be done. Mark's voice crackled over the recording, his nervous tone unmistakable. Said if we didn't, he'd never leave. Daniel listened to that recording with a grim satisfaction, his jaw tight as the weight of everything finally started to shift in his favor. The sheriff's office had no choice now. Warrants were issued. Victoria Langford was arrested first, her carefully constructed mask of authority crumbling as she was led out of her home in handcuffs. Mark followed soon after, along with two other board members who had been directly involved in the harassment campaign. The news spread like wildfire. The same newspapers that had once smeared Daniel's name were now running headlines about the corrupt HOA board, about the criminal charges, about the fire. And the community, once so quick to turn against him, now whispered a different kind of story. Some came forward to apologize. Others kept their distance, too ashamed to face him. But Daniel didn't care about their guilt. He cared about one thing, rebuilding. The lawsuit moved forward, and after months of legal battles, the court ruled in his favor. $600,000 in damages. Enough to rebuild what he had lost, to replace the equipment, the livestock, the barn that had stood as a testament to his family's legacy. But more than that, it was a victory that couldn't be measured in money. The HOA was dismantled, its remaining board members resigning in disgrace. The rules that had once suffocated the neighborhood were rewritten, the power they had wielded over people's lives stripped away piece by piece. And Victoria? She wouldn't be running anything from inside a jail cell. Daniel stood on his porch, watching as the new barn took shape, stronger than before, built with fire-resistant materials, reinforced security, and the kind of determination that couldn't be burned down. Karen stood beside him, arms crossed as she took in the sight. "You really did it," she said, shaking her head with a small smile. "You took them down." He exhaled slowly, the tension that had lived in his shoulders for months finally starting to ease. "They never should have come after me," he said simply. "And they never would again." The neighborhood was different now. Quieter, more honest, without the HOA looming over them. People seemed lighter, freer. Some still looked at him with hesitation, unsure where they stood, but he didn't care. He hadn't fought this war to be liked. He had fought it to survive. And now, as he walked toward the barn, running his hand over the fresh wood, breathing in the scent of new beginnings, he knew one thing for certain. This land was his. It had always been his. And no one would ever take it from him again,